So because we didn't have time to finish that last piece of Sicha Ayin Vav, let's go back to revisit the very end of the Sicha and to take a look at these words again. So this is just the tail end of the Sicha, and then we're going to start to go through different sources relevant to all the earlier points that we just mentioned and we learned at length last week. So the Rebbe says in Sichos HaRan, Gam Amar, Rebbe Nachman said, Leval yenivel mizeh, a person should not become bewildered. Because Rebbe Nachman wanted his Hasidim to learn so much every single day, even if a person is not able, for whatever reason, to devote this amount of time to learning, or the person doesn't have that particular makeup, is not the studious type, he's better with more practical, this worldly matters. Rebbe Nachman says, don't worry. It's not a prerequisite to being an ish kasher, to being a person that's connected to Hashem, a person that's trying to channel the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu down into this world to be a big lamdin. It doesn't say in the Torah you have to be a lamdin. It says you have to try. A person has to try, and every person knows for themselves. We have to be honest with ourselves, what we can, how much time we can devote, and all of us, at whatever level, can engage with limud Torah to the extent that's possible for us, and that's only for us to assess in an honest moment, or honest moments of hispodidus, of reflection every day, to really take a spiritual inventory and assess where we're holding and how much we can add on to our commitments in this regard. But afal pikein, regardless, yachalias ish kasher be'emes, a person can be a good Jew even if he doesn't have the greatest scholarly brain or accomplishments. V'gam kvar siper mizeh, and Rebbe Nachman had spoken about this on previous occasions. Sheyichaylim lias ish kasher, a person could be a good person, a person could be like a kosher person, a proper, a Jew who's living properly, afilu me'enoi yachalul meklal. Even if a person doesn't know how to learn at all, va'afilu tzadik yachalun liyais. Rebbe Nachman says a person can even be a tzaddik, a big tzaddik a person can be. Afal pi she'enoi lamdin klal. These two things don't necessarily have to go together one with the other. You don't have to be a lamdin to be a tzaddik. These are two different things. A person can be a tzaddik, a person can be pure, a person can be righteous, a person can try to the best of his or her capacity to align their lives with the Master of heaven and earth, even if a person isn't blessed with a particularly scholarly brain. Even though he's not a lamdin, a person can be an ish kasher and even a tzaddik. Then Rebbe Nachman adds, Rakbal Hasaga, an interesting thing, to be able to attain this status of what's called Bal Hasaga, which literally means a master of attainment, of perception, to be able to access loftier perceptions of spirituality and the detailed understanding of what takes place in the spiritual realms beyond. Says Rebbe Nachman, to be a Bala Saga, Ein Yechaydan Lias Kim Kishu Lamdin, Begamar Perish Rashi V'Toisvis. That takes the training of the mind, interestingly enough, in the limud, in the tradition of Gemara, Rashi, and Toisvis, for the person to be able then to have a brain, a cognitive capacity that is fit to be able to access loftier hasagas in the spiritual realms beyond. Avalish kasher v'tzadik gamor, but leaving aside Bal Hasaga, to be a simple Jew, a Jew with a pure heart, a Jew that's connected to HaKadosh Baruch in the way of David HaMelech, in the way of focusing on the Shechina and revealing God's presence in the world. Shivisi Hashem lenegdi samid, like David HaMelech said, to place God before ourselves all the time. Says the Rebbe, that you can do even if you're not blessed to have spent the proper requisite time training in Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, even if you don't have that much time to learn every day, even if you haven't amassed that amount of Talmud study or that kind of limud or halachic knowledge, you can be an ish kasher, says Rebbe Nachman. Not just that, you can be a tzaddik gamor. Yechaylun liskais, you can merit to that too. Afilu mishu ish pashut legamri. Even a person who's just a totally simple person, simple-minded person, which, by the way, we've mentioned this previously, was very common in the time of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh and his students, Rebbe Nachman, his grandson, and those early generations. There was very little ability for the regular standard townsfolk, growing up in the shtetl, to be able to devote this amount of time to learning like we have today. Yeshivas was a later invention, and even then, if it wasn't yeshivas, wasn't organized learning, there was very little learning going on at all past the early years, because when a person became physically fit, 13, 14, 15 certainly, they had to go and help their families. They had to go out in the fields. They had to make sure that their families could afford to put food on the table. We've become so accustomed to the lives that we live today that it's hard for us to imagine what life was like, and so we have all this time to make choices and decisions that they couldn't have dreamed of. Every minute was spent figuring out the basic necessities of life. And then if they were able to add on to that mitzvahs, even then they didn't have access to mitzvahs like we have today. Hidurim and thousands of dollars on expensive pairs of tefillin. It was just the bare basics that they had. If they could grab a little minute here to learn, a little minute there to learn, it wasn't like it is today. And even so, they made sure as much as they can as chaburas of working people, tailors and water carriers, and each one of them in certain areas in Ukraine had their own shtibel, their own shtetl, their own chabura, where they would learn as much as they could. But derech klal, the people were simple folk. It's not like we think, the Magen Mizrich had all these great Gaonim and Gedolim learning in his Beis Medrash. That was the top, upper echelon of who these tzaddikim were reaching. But derech klal, these were simple Jews. We read about Tehillim Zagras, Jews who just knew how to say a few kapitel Tehillim. They sat in back of shul. These weren't great scholars. And Rebbe Nachman and the Baal Shem Tov came to the world for this purpose, was to be able to allow these Jews to have the hargasha, the feeling that they had a place too. That Yiddishkeit is not an exclusive club where if you have any hope of bringing Hashem into your life, you absolutely have to be the greatest scholar in the world. That's even a mistake that people are making today. It's not true. Of course, v'gisa b'yayim v'layla, all of us need, like we learned, to try as much as we can to be honest and make an assessment, especially today, that we do have so much more capacity to study and to devote time to learning, and there's so many programs and everything's been translated into English and so many different layers and levels of learning, so much access today to Torah. We have to make an assessment for ourselves to try as best as we can to proceed and to learn with this mahalach or that mahalach, this approach or that approach. That's today. And that's true for all of us. But we should never make the mistake of thinking that this is the only ticket to Kirvas Elokim. Nor should we make the mistake of thinking that if a person is a great scholar, that automatically means that they've had access to the highest kinds of spiritual riches. It's not necessarily true. Chazal themselves didn't shy away from saying something that would be very radical if someone stood up and said it. But Chazal say it, that the Torah could itself become a sam maves, chas v'shalom. It could become a poison if it's not accompanied by the context of the reason that Hashem wants us learning in the first place, which is to become spiritual beings, which is to develop a spiritual consciousness, which is to bring Hashem into our lives in a very deep way, so we can cultivate a spirit of Kirvas Elokim. So these two things don't necessarily have to be contradictory to one another, right? A person can use learning as a vehicle to bring Hashem into his life in a most remarkable way. Talmud Torah, even keneged kulam in some sense. But by the same token, a person needs to make an assessment of his or her life and figure out, is this me? How much can I do? And if I can't devote all of this time that's necessary to proceed in such a deep way, to learn and to accomplish, and I don't have the brain for that, or I just don't have the time or the zitzfleisch, like they say, I can't sit for that long. Not every person's cut out for exactly this thing, chas v'shalom, to give up on this great dream of becoming an ish kosher, of becoming a tzaddik, chas v'shalom. You have just as much access as the next person. You in your way, and he or she in his or her way. Every person has their path. And that's what Rebbe Nachman came to tell us after, and we learned in the previous part of the Sicha, for those who are joining us just this week. Last week we learned that Rebbe Nachman wanted his Hasidim to learn incredibly copious amounts of Gemara and of Medrash and of Halacha and of all areas of Torah. And over here at the very tail end, of the Sicha, where Rebbe Nachman is putting so much on us, he wants to remind us what the tachlis is. The tachlis is to be a person that's living with Yishav Hadas, like we learned, with a settled mind, with a joyous mind, knowing that we're doing what we're supposed to do in this world. We're living a little bit more with Hashem, a little bit more conscious, trying to bring that awareness into our lived reality so that we change the way that we act and the way that we react to situations, circumstances. That's the tachlis. So therefore, Rebbe Nachman comes and says, don't become bewildered when you hear you have to accomplish so much. It can be an ish kasher be'emes if this is not your thing. But all of us have to be honest with ourselves. That's the one thing Rebbe Nachman asks of us more than anything, is to be honest. His spodidus means an hour a day of being honest. Make an assessment. Talk out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu where you are in life. Be totally open, authentic, and honest. There's no time to not be. Make an assessment. And all of us being honest with ourselves, I think we understand that we can all do a whole lot more than the lower part of ourselves wants to convince us that we could do. We could do a lot. Each on our own level, on our own madrega. We can do a lot. We're going to learn more about that. But says the Rebbe, even after making this honest assessment, the lower part of us then is going to want to compare whatever it is that we can do to what the next guy is doing, and to what that person is doing in shul, and what this guy is doing in yeshiva, and how much this one's learning, and how many hours this guy's putting in. That says the Rebbe, no. You do what you need to do. Like Rebbe Nachman says in the story of the Chacham and the Tam, not getting into the whole story now, just one line. Zeh ma'aseh shaloi, v'zeh ma'aseh shali. That's his thing, and this is your business. Lama lanu ledaber me'acherim, says the Tam, the simple person, mamash the simple person, the person who understands the Chacham, the great wisdom of simplicity, shouldn't speak about other people. That's what they need to do, but that doesn't mean that it's what you need to do. You carry on doing the best that you can, but make sure that it's mamash the best you can. That's all. After that, says the Rebbe, you can be an ish kasher, doing your avodah to the fullest, to the max. Even a very simple person, and it all comes down to this all-important Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which Rebbe Nachman quotes in other contexts and other places. V'loi alecha hamalacha ligmar. Don't have to do everything, and you shouldn't feel chas v'shalom, guilty for not doing everything, or to feel anxious that we have to do everything. No. You be okay with what you're doing. Understand who you are, what your background is, what your capabilities are, what your circumstances are, and you're an olam maleh, and there is no relative framework. It's just your life. B'shvili nevra olam. There is no one else. So if you're doing the best you can, then that's the best that can be done. If there's nobody else in the world, just you, do the best you can. But the Rebbe says that doesn't either mean that you can do chas v'shalom, that you can do nothing. Just because you don't have to do everything, it doesn't mean that, okay, so then you slack off. No. Make an honest assessment, commit to whatever kind of limud Torah you can, and whatever method and mahalach works for you. Like we spoke last week, we're just laying out another mahalach, but harbe drachim lamakim, there are many different paths. And this is the healthy balance, knowing that I'm already okay, so to speak, and then I have to push myself in an honest way to see how much more I can do in accordance with my own circumstances. And that is the end of Sicha Ayin Vav, which we began last week, and we're just finishing the last few lines today. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the Sicha, where Reb Nosson had described a little bit of Rebbe Nachman's own learning, and what a goyin he was, what an absolute baki, an expert in Kol HaTorah Kula, which is clear from his writings. But how quickly he would learn and how much he would cover, and how he went, says Rebbe Nachman, in his early ages, he went through Shulchan Aruch 4 times, just when he was very young, because he was young his whole life. He only lived until 39 years old. He was a young man. But as a child, he went through, we had learned Shulchan Aruch 4 times. The first time Al Pi Pshat, the second time understanding the Makar for each din in the Gemara. The third time, al pisoid, to understand the Kabbalistic allusions beyond the simple understanding. And then finally, like we had learned, the fourth time he just put all of these together, and that was in the beginning. And then he carried on reviewing Shulchan Aruch again and again and again. So here in Chaim Aran, we read another paragraph about Rebbe Nachman's own personal limud Torah. And Rebbe Nachman tells us the following. Pam achas, one time siper, Rebbe Nachman told over, she's a samach Yisrael umada, as a chosh mishpat mashach v'asma, that Rebbe Nachman had just begun a new seder learning chosh and mishpat, one of the volumes of Shulchan Aruch that deals with legal and business transactions, damages, and the like. And mashach v'asma, with these two commentaries, V'lamad bizman muat at siman sadi aleph. He had already, in a very short period of time, learned until the 91st siman, the 91st heading, Shu be'erich matayim dapim, which is almost 200 pages. V'amar shu yedea v'zeicher kol sif katan meichun u'maschil, and he said he remembers every single sif katan, where it begins, what it is, where it ends, everything. V'az ha'ilafan of Rav Echad, and then there was a certain Rav, a certain rabbi from a certain city. And Rebbe Nachman had Rabbanim that were well older than him, decades older than him, gigantic poskim and Rabbanim in their own right that were sitting by his feet like children. And so that Rav happened to be sitting there. And Rebbe Nachman started to talk with him in this kind of learning. And the Rav just couldn't keep up. He wasn't able to carry on in this conversation. Afterwards, of Dr. Echad. There was a doctor sitting there. Now, it's not clear exactly what it means that Rebbe Nachman started also to speak with the doctor. Does that mean that it would seem from context that he started to speak to him about medicine, right? Because he's trying to demonstrate that Rebbe Nachman was such an expert that even sitting with experts, they weren't able to hold their weight. But maybe it's also possible, it's not clear, that he was speaking with a doctor in this kind of learning also, but I don't know what the Chiddush is, because why would we assume a doctor would know, Shulchan Aruch Chosh Mishpat? I'm not sure. But Va'amar, then Rebbe Nachman said, Eich loichim sheyizgala v'chulu, shabanigla kal yoysa l'chadesh when the chadesh benister. He said it's easier to have chidushim, to come up with novel rulings in nigla, in the realm of nigla satira, than in nister, to be able to apply earlier rulings to newer circumstances and to come up with other chidushim to understand the meaning of the Gemara and so on. But Rebbe Nachman said, Ve'eni zeicher kol zehetev. Rebbe Nachman again says, like we learned a few weeks ago, he said, I don't remember this whole thing. And then Rebbe Nachman another time was speaking just balpeh, just rattling off dinim, halachas, psukos in Shulchan Aruch. He had an incredible expertise and fluency in Shulchan Aruch. Even someone who had recently learned that particular siman, they weren't able to stand. In contrast, Rebbe Nachman's great expertise. All the great scholars in Rebbe Nachman's presence would be nullified when it came to his expertise in Shulchan Aruch. And another time he says, Reb Nachman, I heard Reb Nachman in his own right was a Talmud Chacham Atzum, a great, awesome Torah scholar, like we've learned in the past, and as can be readily perceived from his master work, the 8-volume Likutei Halachos, where he himself goes through all the halachas in Shulchan Aruch and reveals the deeper understanding and the root of these halachos in the spiritual realms, which is a masterful work. A great scholar, a lamdin. So Reb Nachman says, I also heard B'Shmai in his name, Sha'amar, that he said, Big Gemara Perish Rashi V'Taisus, that's this acronym, Gimel Mem Pei Taf. Said Rebbe Nachman, if I would start to teach that kind of Torah in Nigla, Gemara and Rashi Taisus Rishonim, how you call Alayimdim V'Agadolim Unachim Tachas Kapas Raglei. Rebbe Nachman said, I could, not that he wanted to do this, but he said I could put everyone to shame. Meaning, because it could have been assumed that Rebbe Nachman just knows the Kabbalistic stuff. He's busy with romantic stories and grand ideas in the mystical spiritual realm. Rebbe Nachman said, no, I can also hold my own and more than that in the more, so to speak, standardized classic learning of Nigla, of the revealed portions of Torah. Rebbe Nachman said, that this is not my thing. This is not I don't have a desire to do this. That wasn't what he was in this world for. He was a roif and a fashas. He came to give chizuk. He came to give guidance and avodas Hashem. That was his thing. But that doesn't mean, says Rebbe Nachman, that I don't have the other element as well. And it was important for his Hasidim to know this. He wasn't doing this in a braggadocious way. He was trying to brag. This wasn't the purpose, but it was for the purpose of enabling his students to understand that Rebbe Nachman valued very much the standardized areas of Torah, and he encouraged his Hasidim very strongly to implement these kinds of limudim in their own lives, even if that wasn't Rebbe Nachman's main occupation. Etc. Okay. And then he finishes, which he says in another place in Sichos HaRan, anybody who opens up any of Rebbe Nachman's Sfarim with the intention of giving it space and letting it breathe instead of approaching it with all kinds of assumptions of what it is and what it isn't, just mamish, with a simple open mind and an open heart, to really believe that yesh mashu, that there's something here, and a person starts to look at the Pirushim on the Kuturan and take it seriously. And that's time to read it because it always depends on how you approach something. But if a person approaches it with an open heart and an open mind, you see, if you have any kind of brain in your head, which Baruch Hashem all of us do, you see in a minute, you see what this person was, what kind of mind this person had, what kind of yedias, what kind of fluency in Tanakh, in Chazal, on his fingertips, the way that he weaves Kol HaTorah Kula together. It's breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. So this wasn't the kind of thing where there is a tzaddik who's saying some, delusional things about himself, and it's up to us. Should we believe him or should we not believe him? Rebbe Nachman says in Sichos HaRan, the proof is in the pudding. His lashon later or earlier, I can't remember where in Sichos HaRan it is, but I think we've already learned it, is kamavur heitev bisvarav hakdoshim. Everything Rebbe Nachman said about himself is not something it's not a matter of blind faith to believe, like why should I believe him over any other tzaddik that said great things about himself. When it comes to Rebbe Nachman, it's demonstrable. Open the Sfarim, and you'll see it for yourself. It's going to be very hard to deny that there was something about this particular tzaddik that's absolutely unique. And that's what he says over here. Okay, now let's get into the actual content of Sicha Ayin Vav, where after we learn about Rebbe Nachman's own derech halimmud, seder halimmud, Rebbe Nachman communicates to us that Rebbe Nachman very much wanted his students to learn on a simple level and to cover as much ground as possible, and to learn a tremendous amount al pi pshat, and to first master the simple understanding, and then to go back and to get more deeply into it. And Rebbe Nachman felt, like we learned last time, zeh v'zeh miskayim biyadai. Of course, Rebbe Nachman wants us to understand everything. That's the tachlis. That's the ultimate purpose of learning, is that we should understand, we should be able to apply, we should be able to get clarity. Rebbe Nachman has many Torahs in Likutei Moharan, Torah Samach Beis, for example, Torah Kuf Aleph, and other places where the Rebbe talks very, very openly and clearly about attaining clarity in learning. He didn't want that a person should be confused in his learning, but the Rebbe felt that if we go with this mahalach of learning a lot on a simple level, and then going back to the beginning and reviewing it again, and back and reviewing it again, and so on, Rebbe Nachman felt that a person would get both. We'd get the bikiyas, the breadth, and we'd also get the iyun, the depth, memela. We're going to understand much better if we go with this particular approach. That's what Rebbe Nachman felt. In that section of Sicha Ayin Vav, Rebbe Nachman had also said that even if a person can only read the words alone, just reading the words, Rebbe Nachman says that's also a good thing. That's also enough. Just to read the words, even if you don't understand the depth of it, to read the words. And so here we wanted to bring just a few earlier sources where we can see that Rebbe Nachman wasn't alone in, again, what appears to be a radical approach, saying the words, and that's called limud Torah meichatesi. Where did he get this from? Let's take a look at the words of the Shelah HaKadosh. Sichos HaRan. Va'amar, he says, David HaMelech says in Tehillim Achkimas Pesi, that the Torah brings wisdom to those that are foolish. What does this mean, Machkimas Pesi? Says the Shelah HaKadosh, Lahashmi'enu, goydom alos oisiyas atar she'hem machkimais. We know a lashon from Chazal, oisiyas machkimais. The letters make one wise. The letters themselves. Like Chazal say, oisiyas machkimais. Just the letters themselves make a person wise. The derech ma'od b'zeh pardes and the Heilige Pardes Rimonim the Ramak explains this at length b'shara oisiyos in that segment of his Sefer Pardes Rimonim, which is called Shara Oisiyos, the gate of the letters, Parak Rishon and Parak Sheni, in the first and second prakim, and the first and second chapters there. Told us Adam Chakir Shelah HaKadosh. She says, I've quoted from him in a different place. To Stankom Ashakasav Lamalakim Starch Lekan. Essentially Ayin Sham. Go see over there what we already wrote. But Vishamavur over here he summarizes Pi HaKoire Es HaTorah L'Shem Shemayim L'Zboinin Davar Ma. The Ramak explains that the mouth of a person that reads the words of the Torah for the purpose of connecting to Hashem, L'Shem Shemayim, of being Mekayim, the mitzvah of Limud Torah, and all the different definitions of L'Shema, and there are many. L'Hizboinin Davar Ma, to try to contemplate these words that he's reading, to try to get clarity. Afal pi she'enim mevin, even if he doesn't understand it fully, also biyadai, and in the end, his understanding is so limited that also the other kriyas oisiyos. He just reading the letters. That's all that's left. V'nishar pesi, and he stays a fool k'moishahayim, and not a fool, but he stays with that lack of clarity that he had before he opened the Sefer. He closes the Sefer, nothing changed. Al kol zois yesh ledvekes bechachma v'ya'elu loy la'asid. Just reading the words of the Torah HaKadosh, these letters, these words, these sentences and paragraphs. Says the Shelah HaKadosh from the Pardes Rimonim, you bound your neshama to the realm of chachma. How much your mind grasped or didn't grasp is not relevant. It's not relevant. Because it's not all or nothing. Of course, if we can focus our intention and to try to understand as best as we can, that's for sure the best. There's nobody who argues with that. But Al Kol Panim, what David HaMelech is saying to us is machkimas pesi, is not that it makes the fool wise, but that even the one that remains a pesi after learning machkimas pesi. Machkimas pesi. Because it doesn't say machkimas, and he's no longer a pesi. The Torah makes one wise. It still calls him a pesi, but machkimas pesi. It enables even the person who doesn't grasp what he's learning to connect his neshama to the realm of chachma. Machkimas pesi. Even remaining with that lack of understanding, you bound your neshama, or I bound my neshama. The person who learns in this way can bind his or her neshama to that realm of chachma. And it's going to come to your advantage in the world to come. Pesi. And therefore the Gemara in Gittin tells us, you cannot read psukim from the Torah Baal Peh. Right? You have to read it. It's got to be read because the letters are super holy. The letters in and of themselves. It's a big deal to look at the words of the Torah. Just to read them, even if you don't understand them. And it's also brought in the Heilige Sefer Karakemach from Rabbeinu Bechaya, Rishon Ba'is Taf, at the very end of the Sefer, and the ice under Torah, because it's set up al pi the Aleph Beis, very beautiful Sefer. And the Rabbeinu Bechai says over there, Kriyas Torah, reading the words of the Torah HaKadosh mitzvah gedola, is a great mitzvah. He afal pi shalayavin mashakoire, even if a person does not understand what they are reading. You just have to know that you are reading, right? Be conscious of what you're attempting to do. And again, we don't go into it and say, okay, I could space out and just let my mouth read the words because whatever, I don't need to understand it. It's enough. Machkimas pesi. I don't care if I stay a pesi. I'm connected to the world of Chachma. Says the Rebbe, no. It's not what it is. Says Rabbi Navachaya, it has to be kriyas HaTorah. You have to be conscious of what it is that you're attempting to do. It can happen that a person sits and a person is reading from the Torah. They could be doing Shnai Mikra V'Achatargum, but they're not there at all. I mean, they're not reading. Their mouth is just by rote, mouthing certain letters and words. But that's not what we mean. We mean to be conscious of it, to be focused, to understand that there's holiness here that you're trying to connect to. So we don't want to be shumachashe b'devar macherim, thinking about other things while we're reading the words of the Torah. But v'lachein kriyas haTorah k'sheyodea shu koire, when a person knows that he's reading from the Torah, mitzvah gedoylehi, it's a big, big, big mitzvah. Uschar gadol yesh lo b'zeh, even without understanding it, there's great, tremendous schar from this. And that means to say that even again, Rebbe Nachman comes to tell us you can connect to Torah no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter when you are. That's what comes out of Sicha Ayin Vav. There's never a time where you can't connect. You can always connect. And even if you have a big headache and you're not going to be able to understand what you're learning, open a sefer, read a few psukim. Say Tehillim is also Kriyas HaTorah. It's Mamash Torah Tehillim. Open up the Chumash, open up the Gemara, read a few lines. We have to believe there's more going on in learning than technical, scholarly, sophisticated analysis. It's not an intellectual experience. It's a spiritual experience that utilizes the intellect. Two very different things. Say this again. Limud Torah is not an intellectual experience. It's a spiritual experience that utilizes the vessel of the intellect. But even when a person's intellectual vessel is for one reason or another not functioning, we don't have enough time to fully delve into an Indian, we're not going to be able to grasp it completely. It's 2 minutes before Mincha, you're early to shul. What's the purpose? I'll space out and I'll look around at all the people and wonder, what they did this morning. Because they didn't start Asher yet. No. Pull a Gemara off the shelf. You can read a Mishnah. I'm not going to understand the Mishnah. I don't have time to look at Rashi. Makes no difference. If in relation to that Mishnah you'll stay as much a pesi, a fool, as you were before you, I don't mean a fool, but in relation to that Mishnah you'll stay just as uninformed as you were beforehand, don't think nothing was gained. Pesi, maybe you'll stay uninformed, but machkimas pesi. Machkimas pesi, you've bound yourself to the world of Chachma. It's a big Indian, just reading the letters of the Torah. Actually, in this series, you remember, many, many, many months ago, I can't remember in the context of what now, but we learned from the Chassam Sofer, you remember this? Incredible Chassam Sofer, that even if a person cannot read anything, for whatever reason, you can't even bring yourself to open a Sefer, he says stand in front of the Sfarim Shrank, in front of the bookshelf, and read the titles of the Sfarim. We learned this inside. I have to look it up which shir it was from the Chassam Sofer. Just read the titles. I was probably in the context of yearning. And have ratzon to connect. That's already something. So it's a very holy thing when we have this kind of mindset. It's a whole different approach. So of course, it doesn't mean that now we're putter from understanding Torah and trying to really work on Torah because it's an easy way out. So I'll just open a sefer and just read through the words and that will be enough. Of course we don't mean that. But what we mean is that we have to understand, as Rebbe Nachman does, that life is marked by many different kinds of moments. And just like in the realm of time, there's day and night. And in the realm of space, there is summers and winters, and there's mountains and valleys. The same is true for our lives. And Rebbe Nachman understands that, and Rebbe Nachman addresses that. And Rebbe Nachman says, listen, I'm giving you Torah on a silver platter, no matter what you're going through, and no matter what your circumstance is, there's a way for you to connect. And, like we learned in the beginning of this year, if there's taka no way for you to connect through limud Torah, it can still be a ish kasher, it can still be a tzaddik gomer, but be honest with yourself. It's not about taking an easy way out, which is one of the criticisms on Rebbe Nachman bechlal, and one of the criticisms of this approach of Rebbe Nachman befrat. Because they say, Rebbe Nachman just says, you just read the words. It's for lazy people, chas v'shalom. It's making people lazy. Chas v'shalom. That's why we said in the earlier shiurim in this series, and we mentioned from time to time, everything in Rebbe Nachman, in order to be understood accurately, needs to be understood in the context of all of Rebbe Nachman's teachings. Because if all you ever learned from Rebbe Nachman was this, Einachanami, maybe you'd think, what did he want? He's coming to tell Jews who have the capacity to really sit and focus on their learning and being ma'ayin, that it's enough for them to open up a Gemara and just read the words? Like, it sounds like he's just basically fostering and encouraging laziness. But once a person understands Rebbe Nachman's focus on honesty, Rebbe Nachman's inyan of being able to make self-assessments and bring all of ourselves to the table and connect to our Ratzon Tov, to maximize our purpose in this world, to focus on the Tachlis, etc., etc., etc. To such a person, Rebbe Nachman felt comfortable saying, okay, there's going to be times where you can live up to your highest standards, but what about the in-between times? And what about all the other stages of life? Rebbe Nachman is the pharmacy, so to speak. And in the pharmacy, there are many different medications for many different ailments. And we wouldn't tell one person that has an issue with his toe to now go and take heart medications. One thing that has nothing to do with the other. Maybe on the contrary, it could even be harmful to the person, right? And certainly a person who needs a heart medication, for a circulation, a blood thinner, something extreme like this. You don't tell him to take Tums for acid reflux. It's right. You would be wrong to say such a thing. So the same is true for Rebbe Nachman. It's a pharmacy. And every person in Espodidus, that's like the diagnosis. Every day you come to Espodidus, you diagnose your situation. With vis-a-vis the diagnosis, having been exposed to the full range of Rebbe Nachman, you come back out and in a healthy, mature way, you apply this teaching to your situation. Then your situation changes, there's another teaching. The same is true for this as well. You have to know when to apply it, how to apply it. The main thing is authenticity and a yearning that's complete and that's full to maximize our life and not to take the easy road, not to take the easy way out. Chas v'shalom. So that's what the Shelah HaKadosh tells us over here. It's the same thing. Schar gadol yesh levezev hu shadarsha beperakama d'avodah zarah, and that's what the Gemara tells us. And avodah zarah yutesam debeis la'olam ligris inish. A person should always learn. Even if he doesn't know what he's saying, just learn and learn and learn. Shenemar, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, Garsa nafshi latava. Latava. It says David HaMelech, I didn't learn because I understand per se everything. Garsa nafshi because latava, because I can't hold myself back. The derech harbe and the Ramak speaks about, or rather the Karakemach, Rebbe Nachman speaks about this a lot. Umetzasi Kasav, and he says, I found the pasuk v'hafle, and it's a wonder. Shamar Kasav, the pasuk in Yeshua says, V'higisa boy ya'imam v'layla. V'higisa boy. What does this mean? V'higisa boy. What's this word? Hagaha. Right? What does it mean? A hagaha, a note. Yairaki hagia levad v'akriya ba. It connotes just reading. V'higisa ba ya'imam v'layla. Doesn't mean to be oisik with all your mind and be eon with analysis. Ya'imam v'layla. Not everybody can do that. But it does say v'higisa ba ya'imam v'layla. Just read. Hakriya ba tave al zeh haskula. It's mamish a skula. V'chol shekein imyeh im zetay v'havana ba'atzma mimenu. And then certainly, of course, he brings us back to this, of course, that if a person can understand, and the more the person can understand, the better, and the person understands the secrets of the Torah, that's, of course, the goal. But if a person's, for whatever reason, not able to engage in that kind of learning, just read the words. Read the words with simcha and with yishuv das and with confidence and with a spirit of yearning, of wanting to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who you know is in the Torah. These are holy letters. The Gam Leviim Ksuvim Tidavik Haskula Hazais. Try this, he says, with Neviim and Ksuvim, not just with the Chamisha Chumshet Torah, with Neviim and Ksuvim as well. But B'shuhu Vehu B'shalei Yishtanu L'Lashon Acher. Says the Shelah HaKadosh, when it comes to this kind of thing, it has to be in Lashon Kodesh. It has to be mamish in Hebrew. In Lashon HaKodesh, in the original language, Lashon HaKodesh, it shouldn't be in another language, it should only be in Lashon HaKodesh. And the Chidah adds, commenting on that Gemara that's quoted by the Shelah HaKadosh just now, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, V'amar Rav Alaylam Yigris Inish, a person should always read the words of Torah, V'afal Pi Mishkach, even though he's going to forget, and the Gemara continues, V'afagav D'Le'yada Maka Amar, even if he doesn't really understand what he's saying, he should continue. Says the Chidah, why? And he just hammers this point home that it's not an intellectual exercise, it's a spiritual exercise. Because just by uttering these words, and it's what we're doing right now, just by uttering holy letters of the Torah, it awakens spiritual energies above. Because every letter in the Torah, every letter is connected to one of the spheres, one of the 10 tools or lenses through which and with which or through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals his unity. And every letter hints to one of those holy vessels. Every letter has spirituality. Va'ar, nichbad atzal me'etzam ha-spheres, that's cast upon it from this very elevated place of the revelation of godliness. Very, very lofty thing. Mishtal ad sheyagia arahu ba'oisahu, and this light of Hashem's revelation comes down until, for whatever reason, and Arizal gets into this bepratius, it manifests in this written form. In this image, essentially, because that's what letters are. We call them letters, but they're little pictures, little symbols. And Kabbalistically, each letter, each element of the letter, why a hey is made up with what looks like a dalid and then a yud inside or a vav inside, different aspects. Why a yud is just a dat, tiny little point, and why it's all contained within the yud. All of these are mysteries and mysteries and mysteries that relate to the revelation of Hashem that's manifest through this particular letter. So when you read this, umehevel peh, when a person breathes, and the breath filters through his vocal cords, and it produces through the mouth this letter. He's causing these letters to bind themselves with their spiritual root above. A person says one word of the Torah, all of a sudden every letter that itself reflects its own unique spiritual light comes together with another spiritual light, and it's a yichud. We think it's a simple thing. You just say a Hebrew word. It's not a simple thing at all. It's not a simple thing. You made a zivug. You made a little spiritual soup with 4 ingredients because you said the Hebrew word, let's say makom, the mem and the kuf and the vav and the mem. It's a great event in all the spiritual realms when a Jew says one word of the Torah, whether he understands it or whether he doesn't understand it. One word. Now imagine a pasuk. Now imagine a perek. Now imagine a sefer. Umisibas tnuas koicham with their koiches, with their nekudas, which is a whole other deep thing. And how they interact with one another as you pronounce them from your mouth. You bring about brand new spiritual energies in the world. So the Chidah is explaining why the Gemara is telling us there's a big inyan just to say the words, of the Torah, read psukim even if you don't understand them. It's not an inyan of intellectualization. It's an inyan bringing about great spiritual energies in the world by virtue of your expression alone, irrespective of whether or how much you understand it. Now going back to the Gufa inyan of learning quickly and not focusing right away so much on the pilpul of it, the eon of it, but trying to cover ground like we had learned last week. Says the Heilige Maharal in Sichos HaRan. This shows up in other places too, but this I've seen based on the Sfarim that are bringing different sources that speak about this inyan. This is the clearest of them, and so let's take a look at this together. Very strong lashonos, very strong. Says the Maharal, Al zeh yisaynei adam, how a person should wail, how a person should mourn. Ki gala mimenu k'vayrat Torah hoida v'hadara, because the kavod of the Torah, the glory of the Torah, as gala mimenu, has been exiled. Hoida v'hadara, its glow and its splendor. V'anachnu arumim b'loi Torah, and we are, he says, without clothes. B'loi Torah, without Torah. Woe to this shame, busha uchlima, and to this great embarrassment. Because we've changed, he says, from all the generations before us. All because the Torah scholars have occupied themselves with this thing called pilpul. Now, it should be pointed out that the Maharal's pilpul, what he refers to here as pilpul, is different. I don't fully understand what it was. I haven't been exposed to it. I don't know. But it's different than what we refer to as pilpul today. It seems that in the Maharal's time, there was this fancy kind of intellectualism that had zero application in any kind of practical halachic way. It was something different than what we refer to colloquially as pilpul today, and it seems that that's what he was railing against. And so it might not be as relevant as we think. It wasn't railing against a lot of the pilpulim today have in Inyan, if they do, some of them don't, but have in Inyan lahalacha, that you can actually learn dinim out of it and apply and help us sharpen our understanding of the landis, of concepts, of kedushin, of Hilchas Shabbos, conceptualizations of things that have practical application. But it seems that in the Maharal's time, it just became like some kind of like a game of the scholars to demonstrate how bright they were. But he felt that it was very, very distant from what Limud Torah should be. Still, there's some relevance to us, and let's read it together. He says, even if it's true what Chazal say, even if they come out with something true, the Gemara in Brachas tells us, Haskes u'shema, which means a double lashon of hearing, focus and hear. And the Gemara says, Has v'acher kach kases. Has, case, is a conjugation of these two words. Has means to listen, kases means to grind. Perish Rashi Zal, and Rashi explains shtoik. First, a person should be silent, v'haz and lishmu ascha, and hear the content. Ad shetei shkur b'fich, until you're fluent in it. V'acher kach tischachna v'hiksha aleha ma sheyesh lecha lahakshos, and then get into asking all the questions. But how can you ask a question before you hear what's being said? And then get into the deeper iyun of it, the analysis. Kidarava, like Rava says, the Amar Rava la'olam yilmad Torah. First, a person should learn the Torah, va'achar kach yege, and then a person should toil in it. So that means first we should get a sense for the shetach, for the expansive nature of the content, then delve in. Adkan. And that's what Gemara says. Harelecha, says the Maharal, ki afim pilpul shel emes. Even if it was what he refers to as pilpul shel emes, which might be more similar to the iyun learning that's done in the Sfarim of the Achronim and the yeshivas today. So it's mashma that there was another pilpul he was also addressing that was bechlal not a pilpul shel emes. It wasn't even true at all. It was just an intellectual game. Still, tzarech sheyeh koidem elav agirsa. What should come first is just the simple understanding. How could they even think that they are successfully engaging in sharp dialectics? He says you can't do that unless you really have a sense for the all of it. Otherwise, how do you know that you really understand this point? If there are other points in other sugyas that help clarify the nature of this halachic sugya. So we don't have all the material in front of us. You can't build the IKEA bookshelf, as it were, if you don't have all the pieces that come in the box. First, you need to make sure you have all the pieces. Basically, you get a sense for it. Then you start to build. Says the Maharal, it ends up being a pilpul chas v'shalom shel sheker. It's not even emes. It's easily refuted by another source that it's right there black and white, but this person didn't know that source, and so they can build a whole binyan, but it's easily refuted, and if they would have only learned a little bit more, they would have been able to see that it's not like what they said. And here he says something very sharp here. And again, I want to make this clear. There are different shitas, right? There were obviously gedolim that felt that the yeshiva system today should look as it looks. That's not the point here, is to say, well, look, the Maharal felt, okay, this was the Maharal's shita. There are other shitas, right? But the point of us learning this is to avail us this comfort of knowing, yesh al mi lismich, if our neshama feels drawn to more bekias-oriented derech, and when we're not able to invest this amount of time for iyun, as we learned, there are other kinds of limud. That's the purpose. And Rebbe Nachman revealing to us this particular shita. So he says, the young bachrim, girsa diankusa, if they would have what's called girsa diankusa, if they would have clarity in the younger ages, ein safek klal, he says, they would cover much ground, and before they were married, they would have total fluency in many, many mesechtas. But now, because of the way that the learning is done, there are very few, and it's true today also, there are few bachrim, unless you're talking about the top tier yeshivas, but generally speaking, the bachrim learn Gemara very well, but not many of them, and certainly not most of them, are finishing the Masechta. It's an ideal in many yeshivas. But certainly in the yeshivas that I went to, there were very few of them that mamish took upon themselves to finish the Masechta, to know the Masechta year after year. So he says, they focus on one area and they don't walk out with the whole Masechta. Listen to this, shalimudam taisvis, because they're learning taisvis. Davar shehu, as the word implies, haisafa. It's an addition. It's not part of the fundamental experience of learning just on the simple level. He says, wouldn't it be better if they could just learn the actual Shas, the Gemara with Rashi first, and get simple pshat? Then you get into the analysis. It happens to be that the Bromberg, I think it was them, printing press, happened to print on the page, Rashi, which makes sense, and Taisvis. It says, if they would have happened to print the Piskei HaRash or any of the later Chidushim of Achronim, al Shita Halacha, then everyone would learn differently. He says it's arbitrary. It happens to be this is what's on the page. Afanar Maktanim. So this is what's on the page. You're going to end up learning all of these different drachim. Why? Because that's what happens to be printed on the page. That's not how we decide what to learn or what mahalach to take in learning. Why do they need to know this? And of course the answer is because we're training them. We're training, and that's the answer, right? And it's more exciting when they're able to understand the Taisvis and so on. There is what to answer this, but this was the Shita of the Maharal. They never get to understand how to apply the halacha from the sugya through the Rishonim to the Achronim to the halacha l'maisa. How could it be that the young children and those that are more advanced in their learning should be learning on the same level in the same way? It's ridiculous. You take a kid, you throw him into the deep end, he's learning Taisus in 7th grade. Listen to the sharp thing, I put it in bold. If you tell a father of a son, let his son to learn the Shita Halacha, to learn the Gemara, see clearly, plainly how it's applied, and then aliba de elchasa, and he shouldn't be busy with learning the lamdas of it. Ki'ilu aimer mlai, and this was Rebbe Nachman's whole purpose, was to counter this. He says it's as if the father considers it's as if you're telling him, shlo yilmad klal. If my son's not learning Tosfos, he may as well not be learning at all. Says the Maharal, says Rebbe Nachman, that's treif. That, he says, that's mamish, indicative that the approach to Torah has become warped. Ki ein ha'av chafetz or chefetz rak b'shem. That shows us that the father just wants to have this reputation and his son to have a reputation. My son learns Tosfos, but it's not what's good for his son, and it's not what's good for his son's learning, and it's not what his son needs to be doing. And it turns out that it was for a completely ulterior motive. When it comes to the learning of Torah, and that's what Rebbe Nachman wanted to tell us, it doesn't have to look exactly like this, and if it's not this, then it's nothing. Says the Rebbe, Harbe Drachim Lamakim, and there's a lot to learn. If it's not Gemara, it's Medrash. If it's not, it doesn't have to be. We have to learn exactly this way, and if it's not this way, for lack of time or lack of capacity or lack of interest, then it's nothing at all. Rebbe Nachman came to counter that. Mamash came to counter that. Let's just quickly learn through this Archas Sadikim very quickly. He says in France, says the Archas Sadikim, they would spend a lot of time learning. They would sit in one place, they would just learn, they would plow through the whole Shas. al peep shat. They would just cover ground. They would go back and review it. They were constantly reviewing the shak levataria of the Gemara itself. Not Rishonim and Achronim, just the Gemara. And the Torah was fluent in their mouth. They never stopped. And they were doing this like the Rishonim, as the Gemara in Avodah Zarah that we keep coming back to told us, a person should just read the words. Even if he thinks he's going to forget, even if he doesn't completely understand. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us, first, the person should learn the actual content of a hadar lispar and then analyze. Says the Derech of Sadiqim, with this will end. He says they're not doing this today. And again, the same could be applied today. We don't want to chas v'shalom say anyone's doing anything wrong. Everyone's doing what they've been taught to do. But just to be aware of the plethora of options, certainly as adults who can choose which mahalach better suits our own neshamas. He says today everyone wants to learn all just taisvis. All the novelties and the novel thoughts upon novel thoughts, the Rishonim Achronim Koidim Sheyeda Tzuras HaTalmud, before they know the actual sugya. In Kein Eich Yatzlichu says, how should anybody be matzliach in learning? So strong. We're doing the opposite of what Chazal say. If we're not going to listen to them about how to learn their own Talmud, so who should we listen to? Everything that's written in the Talmud is true. We shouldn't change it. We shouldn't add to it. We shouldn't take away from it. And because of this hyper focus on a very specific kind of learning with intense dialectical analysis, he says Rabbin Parshim and halimmud, like we learned from Sichos HaRan himself. Many people stop learning altogether. Mirov Torah. Hashmuas v'adiktuk sh'aymer alpeh. It's too much. They just want to learn the Gemara. Just tell me what the Gemara says. It's too much. And they stop learning altogether. They say, how could we ever grasp all of these very deep svaras? If only we would just know what's actually inside. What the actual Gemara tells us. Yoim Amalayla, he says, if they would learn in this way, Yoim Amalayla as a Yoimdim v'yibikiyim b'Talmud, they would become bikiyim in Shas. And he says, to counter the svara, they wouldn't be interested. No, they'd be much more interested. They would have a sense of sipuk, a sense of satisfaction with it. They would have a taiva to learn. And then it would be much easier for them to go back and analyze, having all the material at hand. A person would always be learning. Whether he's sleeping, he's slumbering, he's awake, he's not awake. Person's always learning. This is the key point, and with this will end. And they would be learning from Yiras Shamayim. And not like the Maharal says at the end, Chayfetz rak b'shem. Because, we have to learn like this because this is impressive and this is fancy and this is looked upon as being something chashuv and this is something that society values. No, it's not about that. It's about Yiras Shamayim. That's what it all comes down to. What is Limud Torah about? Is it about you or it's about him? Everything comes back to that. Tmimus upshitas means to live life for the tachlis ha'amiti, for that real purpose, not about what you feel. They would learn Yiras Shamayim Shleima. There would be many more students. They would just be learning Torah all the time. But now, because of how convoluted things have become over the generations, it's become like a burden, and they have no interest in it. And instead, it ends up becoming just like a mockery. And they become completely confused, and they spend most of the time just conversing and all these kinds of intellectual games. And what's lacking is the Yiras Shamayim. And it all comes back to this, and with this we end. Yishav Hadas means to know I'm doing not what society expects of me. I'm doing what I was put in the world to do. Don't need anybody else's haskama. I don't need anybody else's telling me, okay, this is chashuv. I need to know that I'm doing what my neshama needs to do. To connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and only I and only you, each of you and each of us, can assess that in our own lives. Are we doing what we can? Are we doing what we should? Do we have this kind of focus on Torah that it's just about how can I take 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, even if it's not Taisvis and even if it's not exactly like this? Torah. We have cheshik for Torah. Oisios machkima, spiritual energies, kirvas alikim, lishma, yirah shamayim, etc. All of us need to make that assessment for ourselves. What Rebbe Nachman does is say, go out of the dafkanus. Doesn't have dafka like this, dafka like that. The whole world is open to you. The whole Torah is open to you. Every kind of learning, every area of learning, just learn with simplicity, with simcha, with yishuv hadas. And in so doing, Rebbe Nachman does us a great service. And many, since I've started just giving this year, last week on Sichos HaRan Samach Vav, people have reached out, you teaching Samach Vav saved my life, changed my life. And this is just one aspect of Rebbe Nachman's derech, but it's a practical one, it's a relevant one, and we should take great chizuk from it and redouble our efforts to commit to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and His Torah, be'ezus HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and just see the Gula Shlema in that merit.